Welcome to Authors of the Pacific Northwest, where we connect authors with new listeners and provide advice to aspiring authors on the business of writing. I'm your host, Vikki J. Carter. Hi there, podcast listeners. Thank you so much for coming back to the Authors of the Pacific Northwest. And today I have a very special author on the podcast, and I'm super excited to talk to him and share him with you. His name is Frank Zafiro. I got it right, Frank, didn't I?
Bang on.
Awesome. So Frank, say hi to all my listeners.
Hello to all of Vikki's listeners.
So you guys are getting quite a treat, listeners, because I don't know if you guys remember a few months ago, I had an article come out in the Bin Bulletin, and the article was featuring authors that are also doing podcasts, and Frank was sharing that article with me. And so I finally was able to get a hold of him to get him on the podcast. So we're going to be talking about authoring and books and podcasts. So it's quite a treat. So Frank, let's start out by you sharing with my listeners what state in the Northwest you live in.
I live in Central Oregon.
Yeah, probably why you're in the paper with me, because I'm not Central Oregon. And so I love it. So Frank, you have a fun background. I did some research like I usually do a little bit before the authors come on, but share with the listeners what your background is in before you as you started to transition into being an author.
Well, I spent about 5 years in the military where I was a Czech linguist in military intelligence. Mm-hmm. And after getting out of the service, I went into law enforcement. And so I spent 20 years as a police officer in Spokane, Washington, which for those that aren't familiar, outside the Northwest is about 220,000 people, about almost 500,000 in the greater metro area these days. And I did just about every job you could do, or was in charge of the unit that did that job throughout the course of my career. Patrol detective, commanded the K-9 unit and the SWAT unit, and retired as a captain. So I got some experience at the executive level as well. So that really helped when it came time to translate that into fiction.
Oh, awesome. Well, first, let me say thank you for your service in the military and as a police officer. We salute you. Thank you so much. And we're glad that you survived and you're able to be a writer, right? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your genre, because my listeners, they know they can go into my show notes and look you up while they're listening to me, but some people are driving. So you got to tell us about your genre, because I love your genre and I can see how your background will lend to that. So kind of tell us about that.
Well, they say write what you know. And, I hadn't been writing fiction for quite a while back in about 2004 when I started writing again. And so when I picked the pen back up, it was crime fiction that started rolling out. So that kind of ran with that. So I write in several of the subgenres of crime fiction. I have a police procedural series. So that's kind of your Hill Street Blues, NYPD Blue, Southland sort of multi-character ensemble cast type of series. Have a PI series. It's kind of a spinoff from from River City, the procedural series. And then I've written some hard-boiled series and noirs, and a couple of them from the perspective of the bad guy. So try to cover a good chunk of the genre. No cozies, and no historical fiction yet, really, but procedurals and PIs and noir hard-boiled. I've been working in that pretty steady.
Okay. So for those that don't understand the hard-boiled or don't know hard-boiled, can't even say it, boil genre, define that for us a little bit.
Oh, that's actually a pretty active conversation throughout the mystery community, mystery writing community. But hard-boiled is, it's that, Chinatown and, your James N. Cain, Postman Always Rings Twice, gotcha. The Parker novels, if you're familiar with that, by Richard Stark. I would say they're, rough characters, very direct writing, bad people sometimes, but definitely all the characters are encountering bad situations. And it's a genre where even if the good guys win, they don't get out unscathed.
Gotcha. I love it. I personally, I'm drawn to that more than some of the other
Me
stuff.
too.
So, because I feel like it's quite a bit more reality in it than some other stuff I've read. So, I also read on your website that you had taken some time also to be an instructor in the community college in law enforcement, and also did you do some writing workshops? So, share with us some of that, because I have a higher ed background. That's what I do full time right now, as I'm in higher ed and working my way towards retirement so I can write full time.
Retirement is grand, I will tell you that.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
I when I was still on the job, I did several different classes that I taught as an adjunct professor at the community college in Spokane and at Whitworth University there.
Mm-hmm.
Just police and leadership related topics, sociology, things that tied right into what my experience was. My undergraduate degree was in history, so that helped me a lot in a lot of ways, but not necessarily on the instruction front.
Mm-hmm.
And so I enjoyed that quite a bit. And then after I retired, I had the opportunity to teach police leadership for the International Association of Chiefs of Police program called Leadership in Police Organizations. And so basically I traveled all over the country for about 4 years, taught this pretty intensive 3-week course to cops all over the U.S. and Canada, and really enjoyed that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But 4 years of spending a lot of time away from your wife and your home, it just got to the point where it was too much, and I wasn't getting the kind of writing done that I really wanted to get done. The stories needing to be told were stacking up, and so a year ago, last December, I hung up my my teaching lanyard and went full time into teaching. I did do some writing workshops when I was back in Spokane. I had a couple of successful ones that were 6-week, once a week, 3-hour blocks per week, and did a pretty simple format. One 6-week block was write your novel. The second 6-week block was revise your novel, and the third one was publish your novel. And so,
fantastic.
Small group, 6-8 people each time, and so you got to have that really hands-on, sort of interaction.
And did any of the students from those groups stay in touch with you, and have they moved forward with their work, or what? Do you keep in touch with them?
Periodically, yeah, not quite as much since I moved from Spokane down here to Central Oregon. But you know how it is. Some people are going to finish their book, and some people are going to constantly be revising their book for the rest of their lives, and some people are just going to kind of fall by the wayside. It's really the way of it. I do hope that some of them follow through on the projects that they were working on, because a couple of them were pretty phenomenal, and they were all different genres. Some people were writing, horror. Some people were writing young adult, and so it was very interesting to see where different people's passions lay when it comes to what they're writing.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I love that you did the writing workshops. I just this last year in my community, I'm connected with the writers in my area, and one of our great writers, he did a workshop through our local library, and then I came alongside, and we just recently did a publishing panelist for independent publishers. We had 3 people that came on my podcast come and then shared with the group that went through the writing workshop how they self-published. It was really a fun experience. And also, I love workshops. I'm a big fan of being a participant and also giving back if you have a skill to share to help.
That's exactly what it is giving back. I mean, the people that have helped me when I was starting out in my career, I can never pay them back. They're miles and miles ahead of me in their writing journey. But to have the opportunity to help someone who's where I was at that time is just it's very satisfying. And so I got together with the local bookstore bookstore. So we held it at the bookstore, which was kind of cool. And, I tried to pick a price point that was enough money that they would take it seriously, but low enough that pretty much anybody that really wanted to could afford it. So it was $99 for a 6-week course.
Oh, that's great.
That's pretty fair. But people didn't decide, it's cold out, I'm not going to go tonight, when they got a little skin in the game.
Yeah. And if any of the authors that listen to my podcast know, as you start looking into starting to work on your work, you can spend a tremendous amount of money and not have the same experience. You can do a lot of things online, but I love face-to-face workshops. And also from higher ed, I feel like we tend to always need to continue our education, and writing is definitely a craft. It's not something we're born with, so I love that. Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about your podcast journey, and then we'll go deeper into your titles, because you have so many great titles. I love it. But, and how we got connected was from the article that came out in the newspaper about you going on the airways with a podcast and me going on the airways. And that's, for me, the podcast genesis came from me asking a bunch of authors that I didn't know how they got started. And then I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, this is such a great thing. And I'm a podcast addict. So I'm like, I can do this. I can do a podcast. So it's taken over my life. So share with us about your topic of your podcast, because it's different than mine. And also the genesis of it. And we'll go into more details after you share that information.
Well, it kind of comes from the same idea as the reason that I did the writers' workshops years ago. And that is, I think the writing community, and definitely the crime fiction writing community that I'm part of, is very collaborative, and people are always looking to help each other out. And I was trying to think of a way that I could do something that would feature other writers, that would help push other writers' works, because I don't have 1 million followers on Twitter, so I can't just Stephen King someone.
Yeah, exactly.
Good book, it's going to be on the USA Today list. And so after thinking about it for a little while, and also like you, enjoying several podcasts, and it occurred to me, I think I can do this. I've done some video editing, and audio editing is even easier. So I started talking to my wife about it, and she came up with a great title. Wrong Place, Right Crime is the name of the podcast. And it features crime fiction authors most of the time, talking about their books and their crafts and their experience, and pretty much anything that comes up as a result of that conversation. Initially, the first 18 or so episodes, I did a format of a deep dive, kind of a 45 to 60 minute episode where we, talk like a couple of late night drive hosts, on the late night radio, and really get into anything and everything. And then I ran into a situation where I had all these people I wanted to have on the show, but, I was 6-8 months out on my schedule. Right? I know you're experiencing that as well.
Yes, I am.
And it's frustrating because you have to tell people no, and so I thought, well, I'm going to add a wrinkle. So I added a different format to go along with the featured episode every month of open and shut episodes, which are just short 8 to 12 minute ish episodes where somebody has a book coming out, and they come on, we talk for about 5 minutes, get to know them, and then we talk about the book for a few minutes, and gives listeners a chance to meet the writer briefly, and then get to decide if the book sounds interesting to them or not. And I do that just about every off week that I don't have the featured episode, and that has allowed me to reach a lot more authors and get a lot more authors on the show and promote their work, and you get to know them. So that's been great.
That's super, super smart. And because about a year into recording, not a year into releasing, because like you said, a lot of my listeners don't know this. Well, they probably know this if they listen to every single podcast. I'm recording about 4 months out, sometimes 5 months out before the episode is released, because that's how quickly word got out that there's this podcast in the Northwest that you can jump on as an author. And it grew very quickly to me having to find the time to do it and say no sometimes. sometimes. But I like the idea that you changed that format a little bit. Because about a year into mine, I got tired of asking the same questions. I was like, okay, I got to change things up a little bit, because for me, after the 50th interview, I was like, okay, let's change it up. And so I started doing a little more and actually expanding a little bit outside of what my scope was. And I've done some different genres than I usually had planned on doing. So I like your short snippet ones that you're talking about. Tell me again, you do one featured episode every month, and then you have in between those weeks are the small ones.
Exactly. Around the 15th of each month, whatever that Wednesday is, the featured episode drops, and that's a good long interview. Mm-hmm. And then every other week, just about. I mean, occasionally I'll have a dark week. Went to Mexico around Christmas time. We didn't do one that week. But the smaller ones are in the off weeks.
Nice. Very smart. I should have thought of that. I have hit going in March will be my full year of podcasting releasing, and I release every week on a Monday. And the only times I didn't release, so I'm very proud of the fact that I have not missed a deadline yet, even when I was starting to do this, because it was a learning curve for me on the whole editing part of it. The only time we didn't have a podcast release was during the Monday of Christmas and the Monday of New Year's this last year. So I feel quite accomplished in the fact that I could do
awesome.
it.
That's well done.
Because you know how it is. I mean, I'm writing too. I'm working on my first novel. And I finished quite a bit of it before NaNoWriMo. I took the month of November, I didn't do podcasts because I took the whole month of November to participate in NaNoWriMo so I could concentrate on just writing, which was so nice just to write. And then I've been doing workshops and things like that in my community. And I also work full time. So it's hilarious because my husband was the one, he also encouraged me to write. And then one day I woke up and said, I'm going to do a podcast. And he's like, what?
He just woke up and said,
I literally woke up and said it. He's like, are you kidding me? And I go, no. He goes, you don't know anything about recording. I go, I've sat in plenty enough studios with you to watch you guys. My husband's a musician. And he goes,
really?
Yeah, not the same thing. And I go, probably not. Let's try it. So my husband, in good faith and loves me so much, then I needed a new laptop, of course, and I needed the new mic. And so I did all the research and got everything I needed. And then I just went for it and I recorded a couple people, and it took me a long time to figure out the whole format. I listened to podcasts on how to do podcasts too. I did a lot of research. And then after about the third interview, I was like, okay, I can do this. I got this down. But he was actually very surprised. I will tell you, he'll tell you too, he's my biggest fan. Because he comes from music background, and we have a lot of musician and studio engineers in our lives. I was terrified to let out my first podcast because I'm like, they're going to know I can't do this. And I'm like, nope, I'm just going to do it, And I've gotten great feedback from all of them. So I'm pretty happy about that. So let's talk about the technology learning curve for anybody that's sitting there in the back of their mind thinking, I really want to do a podcast. It's such a cool thing. Share with us your experience. Was it a learning curve for you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
I think the learning curve exists on a few different planes. I mean, there's the technical learning curve in terms of getting the raw interview. So you got to make sure you have a decent microphone and you're not over modulating and all this kind of stuff. And then there's the presentation piece, learning not to talk over people or trying not to, providing some pauses so it's easier to edit later. I'm a pretty talkative person. I really enjoy the give and take. And one of the things I had to really be conscious of was, this is about the guest, 98% about the guest. The only thing I'm there for is to make it seem dynamic, but it's about the guest. And so there's, coming up with good questions, all of the stuff in the performance side of it. And then there's the editing and production piece that can be a little daunting as well. I went pretty simple. I bought a Blue Yeti microphone.
Hey, me too.
It's the best. And I asked another podcaster, a friend of mine named Eric Beatner. He's one of the two hosts of Writer Types, which is a great podcast, and inspired me to start podcasting. And that's what he uses. And so, and it's reasonably priced, as you know. And I use Audacity as my editing software, and that's open source free software. It does a great job. And so, you get better with everyone. I think I'd cringe if I went back and listened to the first couple of episodes, at least on the technical side of things. They're great interviews. I had Dave Seltzerman on for the first episode, and he was awesome. But yeah, I think I probably encountered much the same curve as you did. I just didn't have a musician husband and a bunch of.
I haven't asked him for any help. I'll tell you that, Frank. He loves to tell the story that he didn't believe I could do this. Right? I mean, he had all the faith in me that I would learn because I'm a lifelong learner. And he tells people, he's like, she's never asked for help from me or any of my friends on this. She'll stay up late and watch YouTube videos, or she'll go read a book, or she'll ask other podcasts, but she won't ask us musicians for help.
Well, good on you. That shows some real dedication and
well, he's fabulous at everything he does. So I have to make sure I rise up to the challenge on my end of things. But the funny story I'll share with you, because I think you'll appreciate it. Any other podcasters that might be listening to this will find this funny. So my first 2 interviews, I didn't have a recording system yet. So I didn't know that. I kind of thought you could record through Skype or something like that, because I use Skype for work. I'm a remote employee for my university. So I do a lot of online work and online meetings and webinars, but I didn't even think about, how do you do interviews? And so I set up my first interview with a girlfriend of mine that is local, and we were going to do it at a coffee house. And I thought, it'd be kind of cool to have the coffee house background in the background. This will be great. And so I cleared it with the coffee house owner, and she's like, yeah, go ahead and do it. No big deal. So we get there. It was the loudest experience in just the background noise. And it didn't dawn on me until I got there and I start recording, and I'm like, we can't do it here. I'm never going to be able to edit that much noise out. And so I had to go back to figuring it out, and thinking maybe I need to find a quiet community room that I can meet people with. And then I read somewhere on one of my searches, and a gentleman said that he was using for his podcast Zoom, and he has people call in. I'm like, oh, duh. I never have to leave my house again. This is awesome. So
yeah, I use Call Note, which is a call recording program, and then it'll work whether I'm using Google Hangouts, Skype, or Facebook. So I just basically use whatever. Google Hangouts is the best for me, but the others work pretty well, and I just use whatever the guest is most comfortable with.
Yeah, that's nice. Well, I've stuck with Zoom, and it's worked pretty good for now. There's only a couple of things that I'm not thrilled with it, but I think that's just the nature of technology. It's never going to be perfect. So let's talk a little bit about, I wanted to mention Audacity too. So, what's funny is that I started out with Audacity and I use the Mac. And then all of a sudden, halfway through about episode 6 or 7, my Audacity stopped working and I had a panic attack. I'm like, no, I have episodes to get out, So I ended up I just now use GarageBand. I just edit in GarageBand. And I'm like, okay, that works.
I just got through listening to a podcast that went for like 5 years called The History of Rome. A guy named Mike Duncan did it, and you can really hear the difference in the quality of the podcast from like the first episode to about the 10th, and then it evens out after that. But he used GarageBand the entire time as well. I think it's Mac answer to Audacity.
I think it is too. And I was a little nervous about using it to start with because it does have a bit of a learning curve on it. But all of my studio musicians that have professional studios, they use GarageBand for quite a bit of stuff. So I was a little familiar with it from watching, not because I've actually played with it myself. But the one thing I found that I didn't like was that it does change my levels. Like GarageBand will just notoriously take the levels down really far on a finished piece. And I was listening to one and I couldn't hear anything. I'm like, oh no, now I have to fix this. So I had to go and do some research. And so moral of the story to any of you that are listening about podcasting and you think you want to do this, you might be spending a few nights in a panic watching YouTube videos, figuring out how to bring the levels of your audio up before you release it.
I released one, after you record your show and edit it, you have to export it, you have to, and I just export as an MP3 file, but which is also coincidentally the format of the interviews, the raw interview footage. And I uploaded one show. It was when I interviewed Fleur Bradley, and I got a email from my friend Eric actually, who said, "Hey, dude, you just uploaded the raw interview there."
Oh no, that's my biggest fear.
And I was away from home when he emailed me that. I left almost right after I uploaded it, so I was able to take it down, but I wasn't able to fix it and get to the file for a few days. So,
well, thank you, friend, for calling. But still,
absolutely.
That seriously is my biggest fear. So I do it a little differently. I have quite a process, but I go from WAV to MP3 and then back. So I'll use WAV to do my sound levels because I've used a different program to make sure that GarageBand isn't leveling it down too far to bring all the levels up to a nice sound. But so I actually label all of my episodes that I'm working on as I'm editing them. If I leave them on my desktop and I get it to final, and then if it says final, I know it's the one I can send out. But here's the thing: I'm so paranoid of that happening. I'll listen into iTunes almost in entirety after editing and finishing before I load it up into my platform.
Yeah, I'm just as worried these days. I grabbed the wrong file because I was in a hurry, and it was I don't have thousands of listeners, so I didn't get thousands of emails. But
I don't have thousands.
I'm glad I got the one.
But I'm terrified of making the wrong, doing that, and then having the author come back and say that wasn't that great. I'm like, oh dang, what happened? So anyways, because for me, it truly is the way I do the format for the podcast. Like you said, it's really about the guest. And I love to have authors on and them share their work. And I want people that are listening to the podcast to fall in love with them and buy their work, and learn about publishing and writing at the same time, and hopefully inspire somebody else to write a book or something. So it's a total labor of love. I don't want it to sound like crap.
Yeah, we have the same mission.
Yeah. So thanks for all you listeners to enduring our podcast geek moments as we were talking.
Insider baseball there.
It's so much fun for me to talk with somebody else that's doing a podcast because I don't talk to that many podcasters. I read a lot of blogs, but I don't talk to a lot of them. So it's a lot of fun. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Of course.
So let's talk about you and your writing again. So you have several series. So share with our listeners who don't know you so they can get hooked, your series. And then we'll talk about the book that you're actually going to read from today.
Okay. I guess my flagship series, you could say, is called the River City series. It's that ensemble cast procedural series that I mentioned at the top of the show. It starts with a book called Under a Raging Moon, set in 1994, and moves forward from there. And the idea there is kind of like, Southland and NYPD Blue. You've got half a dozen or so characters that ebb and flow in their roles throughout the different books, and it's set in fictional Spokane. I fictionalized it because I was still on the job when the first book came out.
I was going to ask that question if any fellow members of your precinct.
I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure how they'd respond, and even though the series is a very positive series in respect to law enforcement, I mean the cops are definitely the good guys in this series, no question about it. They're not perfect by any means, but they, they're the good guys, and but I still wasn't sure, and so I used a pseudonym and gave Spokane a pseudonym as well. So it's very thinly veiled River City. Initially, I made a few changes just for the sake of changing things. And after the first couple of books, I stopped changing anything I didn't have to. And people dig that. If they're from Spokane or they've been there, they like to be able to envision where this is happening and so forth. And so this series has 5 books now, with 2 more should come out this year, by the end of the year. There's been different characters that have been the main character or supporting character, but really 1 or 2 have kind of emerged to be the center of the series. There's Thomas Chisholm, who's a veteran police officer and Vietnam vet. Remember, this started in 94, so Vietnam wasn't that long ago for some. And he's your typical, well, nothing typical about him, but he's your career patrol officer who looks out after all of his team members, and including even his sergeant, who has some wit, but is also pretty intense. The veteran that everybody looks to. And then another character that really emerged as a kind of the heart of the series for me, and will be at least through book 7, is an officer named Katie McLeod. And she became, she had kind of a support role in the first 2 books, had a pretty big event happen to her in the second book that was a pretty difficult one to write, much less for her to go through. And then by the 3rd book, she was arguably would be the star of the movie if it was a film. And what I like about her is that, you remember these start in the mid 90s and will be up to 2003 by the end of book 7. So I guess it's historical fiction. And she's loosely, she's dealing with, being a woman in what was largely, and I guess still is largely a male-dominated field. And that's a tricky thing to do because, she doesn't want to sacrifice her femininity, but she certainly wants to be a professional police officer, and she wants to be known as a good cop for the right reasons. And, she's vulnerable, but tough. And she's definitely become, if not my favorite, one of my very favorite characters in the series.
Let me ask you this before you jump into the other series. Did you plan this as you were going, as you were writing these books, or did you have a loose kind of idea where things might be going and you just let the characters come to you as you wrote?
What I had the biggest idea about was the primary obstacle that the cops were going to have to face. So in the first book, it's pretty straightforward. They're facing a serial robber who's hitting convenience stores and becoming progressively more violent. And so I knew that was what they were going to deal with. And then I kind of pantsed it a little bit in regards to how they chose to deal with it. I knew a few scenes were going to happen, but how we got there was kind of happened as it happened. As the series has progressed, that's somewhat remained true in terms of here's the obstacle that they're going to face. But I have had to be a little bit more structured in terms of what's going to happen because there's so many interlocking parts now because you're getting into, 4 or 5 books and so forth. So I do plan them a little more now than I did for the first book.
Awesome. Well, the reason why I ask is the way you talked about Katie is it sounded like she developed as you were writing her.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I love that. And I think readers feel that as they're reading, they're like, oh man, she's coming out of the woodworks as this amazing character, and they're going to fall in love with her as much as you did as you were writing her. So, yeah,
it was an interesting journey because initially in the first book, there's always Thomas Chisholm, but probably the main character of that first book is a young officer, 3 years on the job, named Stefan Kopriva, and he's kind of a hotshot, not in a bad way, but kind of in a positive sense of the word, and the Katie McLeod character, as she was finally realized in the finished version of the book, initially everything she did was split into two different characters. There was Katie McLeod and this other officer, and they both, Katie McLeod was the love interest, and this other officer was dealing with some pretty heavy stuff of her own. And I realized this all needs to be the same character. I mean,
I see.
One of them's quite enough on their own, and I want a strong character. So I merged them both into just Katie. And so she had, a support role in that first book. And then in the second book, she kind of started to steal the show.
I love it.
And Kopriva, spoiler alert, but Kopriva leaves the department after the second book. And actually that's the second series I'll tell you about, which is Stefan Kopriva Mysteries. He leaves the job after the second book in the series. And there's a spinoff series of first person mysteries that star Kopriva. And those are set 10 years after he leaves the job. So they're 2005 and forward. And there's 3 of those now. The first one's called Waist Deep. And for Kopriva, it's largely, it's a redemption arc. It's a redemption tale. He leaves the job in a bad way. And so,
gotcha.
He's looking for some redemption, and he gets some in the first book, but maybe not enough. And he's still working towards it 3 books in.
Like a human would, right?
Like any human, exactly. And those are the only 2 series that I write by myself. I have several different series that I write with other authors. I mentioned Eric Beatner earlier, my friend, and he's another author. He and I teamed up for a series called the Bricks and Cam Jobs, or the List series, if you prefer, because the word list is in all the titles. It starts in the back list, and then the short list, and the getaway list. And the back list, where it all kicks off, is about these 2 hitmen, Paula Bricky, aka Bricks, and Cam. I forget Cam's last name. Eric wrote Cam, and I wrote Bricks.
I was going to say, I don't know how you keep everybody together anyways. You have so many books you've worked on. I can only handle one.
Well, we wrote it in a format that I've used in several different series with several different authors, and that is a dual first-person narrative with alternating chapters. So I wrote Bricks and he wrote Cam. So like chapter 1 would be Bricks from the first person, and then chapter 2 would be Cam from the first person. And it works really nicely on a variety of levels. For one, as writers, you really can focus largely on writing your half of the book, although there's a lot of overlap. From the reader's perspective, you get the intimacy of the first person. You get to be the head of a character in a way that you can only be in first-person narration. But because you're getting 2 different perspectives, you know more than either of the narrators do, and you get a more complete picture like you do in the more of a third-person style, third-person POV. And so what's going on in the backlist is that the mafia is downsizing.
I know they did that.
they're running into some financial problems.
So they're just killing everybody off.
Well, they decide that they give both Bricks and Cam, unbeknownst to each other, a list of backlist of accounts that need to be settled, and tell them, hey, we got a couple of people doing this, and whoever does the best job gets to keep their job. The other person gets laid off.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So Bricks does her thing and Cam does his thing, and of course eventually they come across each other, and I won't spoil any more of that. But
but I love the premise. That's fantastic. That's really, really good.
And then I wrote a series with Jim Wilski, who's a great short story author, and he wanted to write a novel, and he wanted to give it a try as a collaboration first. And so we collaborated on what we call the Anya series that was just re-released by Down and Out Books. And we use that same format of that dual first-person narrative with alternating chapters. And it's kind of an interesting format for this series, though, because in each of the 4 books, it's 2 male narrators, and we each took one of them. And yet the series is called the Anya series because this kind of siren, grifter, femme fatale sort of character named Anya. She's the thread that links all 4 books because it's a different 2 narrators each book in a different city. I mean, Blood on Blood, the initial one is in Chicago, and then we go to Vegas in Northern California. And then in the prequel, Harbinger, which just came out recently, we go down to Florida and get her origin story. So that was pretty fun. The first guy I ever collaborated with was Colin Conway, he and I wrote a standalone set in my River City universe called Some Degree of Murder. And that's just been reissued by Down and Out Books as well. And we've teamed up with a new series, 4-book arc that starts in Charlie 316 that will be out in June. And in Some Degree of Murder, that's where I came up with this dual first-person narrative that I used in some of the other books. But when we teamed up again after, we wrote Some Degree of Murder in like 2005 and published it in 2012, and we just got Charlie 316 going about a year and a half ago. So after a good 12, 13 years of not writing together, when we came back together to write some more, we went with this more of a standard, third person, multiple characters
Gotcha.
viewpoint for this. And Charlie 316 is kind of a topical novel because in the opening scene, a police officer is involved in an officer-involved shooting on a traffic stop. But there's a few twists. When the investigation starts, turns out that the driver was shot in the back and that there's no gun on the scene. And then in another little flip of the script, the driver who's killed is a white guy, and the officer, who is a stellar stand-up officer, pretty much a model of what a good officer looks like on the police department, he's black. And so it's kind of the opposite of what
flipping it around a bit.
country, yeah. So and so that's a 4-book arc that we're working on. I also wrote a couple of books with Larry Kelter, New Yorker. We wrote The Last Caller, which was a straightforward detective novel starring an NYPD detective trying to solve a crime. That was a first person, just a single first person, which I was a little leery of when Larry said, "Yeah, I don't want to do that dual narrative thing. It's cool and all, but I just want to do a first-person single voice. I want this guy, John Mochia, to be just the one character." And I was a little worried that we would have, a schizophrenic guy who, when I wrote these chapters or this scene, it would sound one way and then his would sound a different way. And we'd have somebody it would be rough and uneven. But ultimately it wasn't. It wasn't exactly my voice or his voice, but it was a singular voice. And I attribute that, I think, to the fact that we both very heavily edited the entire book, regardless of who wrote what. And so, maybe Larry wrote this chapter, but my editorial hand is pretty heavy in there too. And so the voices kind of meld all the way throughout. And when we turned to write a book called Fallen City later on, we decided to do that in third person, multiple viewpoints, and so that came out a couple of years ago, and that's an historical novel too. It takes place in the late '80s, early '90s in Washington Heights, New York, during the height of the crack epidemic, and against the backdrop of the Dominican gangs that were driving that. But those are the series that I've written. Got a few standalones as well. Yeah,
you have about 1, 2, 3, 6 of them. I'm looking on your website. So listeners, you got to go on the website. There's just a tremendous amount of work, a body of work on here. So 6 standalone. Now, I don't know where you have time to do a podcast, honestly. Where do you have time for all this? Crying out loud.
Well, keep in mind that, roughly half of my books have been collaborations. And so, that's like writing about 3/4 of a book, not a whole book. So I cheated a little bit.
You're making me very interested in collaboration by listening to how you're working with others. I think I love collaboration in a lot of ways because I do a lot of work and I love it. I just never really thought of, seriously collaborating on novels, collaborating on anthologies or something short or small, but not novels to the extent that you've done. So you're making me think about that idea.
Well, the thing to think about if you're contemplating that is it has to be, I've been very fortunate in that everybody I've collaborated with, including Bonnie Paulson, who I wrote The Trade-Off with, just one of those standalones. All of them have been outstanding people who, sure, they were good writers in their own right, and that's, of course, important. Mm-hmm. But just as important is the willingness of both writers to subordinate their ego to the book. And much like when you hand your book to somebody that, is a friend of yours and said, hey, be brutal, but be nice. And they come back and they say, you need to change this, and this is stupid, and this sucks, and this is great. Yeah. They're on your side. And if you can do that with your collaborative partner, you always end up with the best possible book you're going to get. It would be damn near impossible to do that kind of collaboration with someone if it was my way or the highway type of attitude.
Exactly. But here's the thing that I'm finding, and I'm relatively new to working on my first novel. I'm a historical fiction writer, and
what time period are you studying?
Elizabetharian around. Oh. Yeah. So and I wrote almost the whole novel. It's almost all completed. My first draft. I say it's my first draft. It's probably the 10th version of the first draft. And finally got my courage up to work in a writer's group. Now, the writer's group I'm with is a very special elite writers group in our area. They invited me in, and I was like,
wow, that's awesome.
You don't even know my work yet. You never really read it. But they saw the work I was doing with authors in the podcast, and they were hearing, about stuff and really believed in me. And I was terrified, and I've been with them now. We've gone through several chapters of working on my work. And my first fear was getting that feedback and how I would handle it. It has been the most amazing experience. Mm-hmm. So we meet every 2 weeks and we share with each other. Each one of us are in a first draft of a book. Some of them have already been published several times in their career. And 2 of them are journalists. And so it is some of the most exciting time to have another author come in and say, hey, did you think of this? Or did you know that this should be, maybe you should look at it this way, and I found so much joy in it where I thought I would be terrified and get terrible feedback. Now I have a very positive group. So that's
Absolutely.
A big plus.
That's all the biggest thing right there is that positivity. Yeah. My friend Colin, my writing partner at this point, he joined one about a decade ago and had exactly the opposite experience, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And it really did a number on his confidence when he didn't write for a number of years. And, it really took having some positive experiences to bring him back into the fold a bit. But, it's all about, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to help each other out, or trying to make somebody else feel like you're better than they are?
Yeah.
Something like that.
We were just talking about that in my group. So one of our members that actually formed this group, he had another writers group that he met with in another city, and he had that group for a long time. He's the author that's been published 4 times, traditionally published 4 times. So he's kind of like, I call him my godfather in writing, because I feel like he's my sage and great advice. But he told us this last time we met that he just finally disbanded that group that he'd been with for years because of one person in the group was so super negative. And no matter how often he tried to guide and get that person to share great feedback and helpful feedback, it just did a number on everybody. And after being in the group with us, because we just formed this version of us, and we've been meeting long enough to feel like we're really comfortable with each other, he's like, I can't go back to that group where there's that negativity, not when you have a positive experience, and
life's too short to deal with that.
It really is. And when you're a writer, we already deal with self-doubt. So we don't need the added pressure of somebody making you feel like crud.
Well, and you can tell me all day long that this sucked or this was horrible. Or I mean, my wife, Christy, she's my first reader, and she's brutally honest, but I know not only that, how she feels about me with, being married. I also know that she's a fan, that she believes in my writing. She believes in my books. She enjoys them, but she's not afraid at all to say, well, I don't believe for a second that Katie would do that, and here's why.
Yeah.
Or this made no sense, or this person is stupid. Why is he even in this book? My most recent book, the one I'm going to read for you here in a bit, I guess, is the Menace of the Years. It's the Fifth River City book. And because a character dies in the Fourth River City book, I mean, with the title of And Every Man Has to Die, you have to guess that somebody might die. Mm-hmm. I kind of had to change some dynamics a little bit. And so I brought some minor characters, a couple of minor detectives, and gave them a bigger role in this book, Detective Finch and Detective Elias. And, I've written like 5 or 6 different short stories. One's basically novella length with these guys, and I like them and I know them. And Christy did too, but she did not dig them at all in this new book. And she's like, you need to cut out Finch and Elias. They suck. It's like, well, I can't cut out Finch and Elias, but tell me why they suck. And, and some of the, and she wasn't being mean at all, because she's like, I love this book. And she believes in me 100%. But having that, you can take that kind of harsh criticism or that blunt, direct criticism when you know what the person's intent is. You to have a better book. They want you to be successful. Yeah. If you're going to collaborate with somebody, to bring it back around to that, and write a book together, you have to have some pretty important conversations early on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the conversations would probably go on as you're writing, so I love it. I think it's fantastic. But you know what? I know my listeners are dying to hear your story, some of your writing, and so am I. So I'm ready to go. So let's do this. So set up the scene for us that you're going to read around, and without, sharing too much that nobody will buy your book. But they have plenty of books to choose from. Seriously, people, there's a lot of books on his website you can purchase. And then I'm going to go quiet and let you listen. I'm going to listen while you read. But before we do that, I have one other question, Frank. I read somewhere that you're going to be in Portland for a convention of some sort. So share with us, our listeners, about that.
Vancouver, actually. Vancouver, British Columbia.
Oh, yeah. Oh, one of my favorite places in the world.
Yeah, it's nice. I taught up there when I was teaching the leadership courses. And it's a pretty well-known mystery conference called Left Coast Crime Conference. And they bounce around all over the West Coast, different location each year. It's not the biggest of conferences, but it's good sized. It's and it's meant to be both a reader and a writer conference. And I'm heading up there. Got my panel assignment earlier this week.
Yay, that's exciting.
Yeah, and then a really cool thing happened. There's this thing called Noir at the Bar. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't, and that was another thing I was going to ask you about, because I saw that too. So explain that to us.
Noir at the Bar is something, I can't remember the first couple of guys that did it back on the East Coast, but Eric Beatner is largely responsible for kind of getting it resuscitated and up and running. But it's all over the U.S. now, and anybody can host one. It's not a copyrighted sort of thing. But what it is you get 5 or 10, somewhere in there, a number of crime fiction authors together in a bar, and they all read maybe 5 to 7 minutes from something aloud, and people listen and drink, and because they're drinking, you sound like
you're fantastic,
Dashiell Hammett or Hemingway or something, and it's a lot of fun. It's a good fun. So I was really pleasantly surprised when the guy that is organizing the Noir at the Bar up at the Left Coast Crime Conference asked me if I'd take part in it. And I couldn't say hell yes soon enough. I mean,
no, that sounds so great. So hopefully, when is the conference going to be? So
it's at the end of March. I think it's the 28th to the 31st, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, lucky us that your podcast will be coming out. So listeners, if you're listening and you're like, right before this, and you happen to be going up to Vancouver, go to the conference. Go up to Frank. Yeah, help him out and say, I heard you on Vikki's podcast.
Yeah, for sure. That's one of the best things about conferences is all the connections that you make, all the people you get to meet.
Yeah, there's nothing more exciting to an author or a podcaster when somebody comes and says, I love your podcast, or, oh my word, you're my favorite author. You just feel like, the world could end right then and there because you're so happy.
And I don't care who it is. I don't care if it's Stephen King. it always is welcome when somebody says, "Hey, I really love your work," and nobody gets tired of hearing that.
No, we don't. We really don't. Okay, so Frank, set us up. I'm going to go. I just wanted you to share that information because it's timely. I want people to go find you. So set us up. I'm going to go on mute so you can share with us your story, and afterwards I'll take us out.
Okay. This is an excerpt from The Menace of the Years, which is the 5th River City book. And actually, it's the very beginning of the book. It's the opening chapter, and you get to meet Katie McLeod here. So at the beginning of the book, there is an epigram that I want to share with you. It's a quote from Henry Miller that says, "The world dies over and over again, but the skeleton always gets up and walks." So obviously, chapter 1 is taking part in part 1, and this is set in River City, Washington on December 27th, 1999, Y2K. And we are, is coming up, and we are on a Monday at 03:26 hours. Officer Katie McLeod jumped slightly at the alert tone that broke into the early morning winter silence which had settled into her patrol vehicle. She'd been staring at the amber screen of her newly installed mobile data terminal, trying to figure out all of the commands to navigate through its various screens. She'd been at it for over half an hour, struggling with what seemed to be unnecessarily difficult key combinations for the simplest of functions. At least this graveyard shift had settled into a quiet one shortly after bar closing, allowing her to focus on learning this new tool. Computers were supposed to make things easier, she thought, not harder. The alert tone was accentuated by a flashing text on the 4-inch screen. "Baker 112, 16, and 22, came the familiar steady voice of Janice Kozlowski, one of the graveyard dispatchers. She didn't wait for the patrol units to acknowledge her initial call. 2808 East Joseph, report of a burglary in progress. Katie dropped her car into gear and started in that direction. There was a time when a call like this would have resulted in a flood of adrenaline, but now it barely registered a drip. Too many false alarms, she supposed. And too many times dealing with the real thing, she realized a moment later. Even so, she turned on her overhead lights, not bothering to engage her siren. Traffic was nearly non-existent at this hour, and there was no need to let the bad guys know she was coming. Janice continued her broadcast. The neighbor from 2809 reports 3 to 4 men approaching the victim house. One may have been carrying a rifle or shotgun. Calls into the residence go unanswered. 2808 East Joseph, burglary in progress. At the mention of firearms, the missing adrenaline zinged through her. Katie eased through the S-curve, climbing to Illinois Avenue. The roads were mostly clear, but still moderately slick. Not quite chain weather, but bad enough to warrant lower speeds and extra attention to her driving. She reached for the microphone, instinctively waiting for Thomas Chisholm to acknowledge first. Baker 112 from Francis and Wall, came Chisholm's gravelly voice. Katie uttered a clipped 16 copy into the mic and returned her hand to the wheel. 122 3400 West Carolina, Connor O'Sullivan transmitted, obviously out of the car and on his portable radio. She pressed her lips together, the thrill of catching a possible burglar momentarily dampened. Both men were outside of Baker sector. Chisholm was coming from a favorite graveyard patrol break location, a convenience store where officers frequently stopped in for coffee or to write reports. It was one of the few that was clean, had a few booths for sitting inside, and an owner who was law enforcement friendly. And it was only 6 blocks into Adams sector. Sully's location was even deeper into Adams sector, off Indian Trails. She knew why he was there, understood it completely, but it still meant that she was going to arrive on scene long before either of them. Janice obviously did the same math. Any units closer than Baker 122? She asked. There was no reply. Katie knew James Kahn and Paul Hero were out at jail, booking someone on a domestic violence call from an hour ago. Sergeant Shen had returned to police headquarters to do whatever sergeants did in their offices. Paperwork of some kind, she figured. Aaron Norris finally chimed in. Anna 105, I can start from Joe Elby. Not closer, Katie muttered. It was actually about the same distance away as O'Sullivan, but that wasn't the part that irritated her. The fact that Norris was at a Joel B. Stadium told her he was parked and probably sleeping, if he was alone. Already past your location, O'Sullivan replied, and Katie could hear the big block of engine of his patrol vehicle surging in the background. Be careful, Sully, she whispered, and no sooner were the words out of her mouth than the back end of her own car slid to the right. She corrected immediately, keeping her movements small and controlled, and steered out of it before any skid could develop. When she turned onto Crestline, she found it recently plowed. Strips of asphalt showed through the snowy street in patches, and she risked driving faster. If there had been traffic, she probably wouldn't have, but empty streets begged for greater speeds. At Wellesley, she turned right and found the roadway even clearer, so she punched up her speed as fast as she dared. Any update? Chisholm asked the dispatcher. Negative 112. Katie braked for Regal, turning northbound. She had to slow down again. The street had at least 2 inches of snow and ice, crisscrossed with tire tracks. She shook her head in mild frustration. It hadn't snowed since sometimes yesterday, and the plows hadn't made it past the arterials yet. Joseph Street approached quickly, even at her reduced speed. 2 blocks away, she killed all of her lights, cutting through the wintry night like a stealth bomber. She knew 2808 would be on the south side of the street, probably the second house from the corner, so she pulled up short of the intersection. Baker 116 on scene, she transmitted, then shut off the engine without waiting for the reply. She was out of her car in a flash, sliding her side handle baton into her belt with one hand and easing the driver's door shut with the other. The latch caught with a muted click, much quieter than the telltale sound of a slamming door. With any luck, they still didn't know she was coming. Mounds of snow lined both sides of the sidewalk, creating only a narrow footpath for Katie to walk on. She strode as fast as she could while remaining quiet and hopefully not slipping and falling on her backside. As she approached the corner, voices cut through the cold night air. Now, 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 came a male voice, gruff and confident. They're still here. Another shot of adrenaline flared in Katie, feeling like a warm spray on her shoulders and chest, then zipping out to her extremities. She crouched slightly and drew her pistol, all without breaking stride. Let's go, ordered the same voice. A car door opened and quickly slammed shut. Ricky, goddammit! Katie abandoned the sidewalk and moved swiftly to the side of the brick house on the corner. She needed to have some kind of cover before she engaged the suspects. With her left hand, she reached up and keyed her mic. 16, suspect still on scene. Copy, 16. Katie reached the corner of the house. She was keenly aware of the large plumes of her breath visible thanks to the corner street light. The porch light of the house she was next to was turned off, and she was grateful for that. Porch lights blazed from several other houses, though, and Christmas lights threw colorful beams across snowy lawns. A car engine rumbled to life. Ricky! Katie peeked around the corner, bringing her gun up in case she had to fire. A green four-door was parked in front of the victim address. A wiry man in a black ski mask stood in the open passenger doorway, looking back toward the house. She couldn't see if he had a weapon or not, but if the complainant was right and he had a rifle, then she was severely outgunned. Then again, at this distance, if he had a shotgun, the advantage went to her. Engage or wait? Tactical considerations flew through her mind like algebraic equations. She was outnumbered, but didn't know for sure by how many. Possibly outgunned. At 30 yards away, and with only porch bulbs and Christmas decorations for light, her accuracy with a handgun under stress was questionable. The backdrop, for any shot she'd have to take, was residential houses on the other side of the street, likely full of sleeping people. Innocent people. She knew she should wait for backup. Watch and wait. Try to get a good look at the suspects, the license plate on the car. A shrill scream erupted from inside the house. Ricky, now or we're leaving! The man at the passenger door of the car bellowed. No, Katie thought, they're not getting away. She took a deep breath to steady her nerves, then leaned against the corner of the house for support as she raised her Glock. River City Police, she yelled, her voice carrying across the dirty snow between them. Don't move. The man's head snapped back toward her. Without hesitation, he raised a rifle from along his leg and pointed it toward her. Katie ducked and moved around the corner just as he blasted away at her. The heavy boom echoed through the air, followed by an unmistakable click-clack racking sound. Shotgun, she realized. Eat her, Mike. Shots fired, she said, trying to keep her voice even. Immediately, a siren erupted in the distance, followed by a second even further away. The sound was comforting for a brief moment, until followed by another realization. They won't get here in time. She was on her own. Katie made a quick move to look around the corner again. The man was still pointing the shotgun in her direction. She ducked back as he fired another blast at her. The pellets tore into the brick, sending chunks showering into the air. She didn't wait for him to rack another round. As fast as she could, she leaned around the corner, drew a bead on the shadowy figure, and pressed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, but the sound made it seem like a muted pop to her. She wondered for a moment if she'd had a malfunction, but when she fired again, everything still worked. She heard the metallic thunk as her rounds struck the car. The man ducked inside the open passenger door, slamming it shut behind him. Katie hesitated, then fired again at the side of the door. She was rewarded with another satisfying slap of bullet-on metal. The engine revved and the tires spun on the icy roadway. The car slid to the side, then fishtailed back the other direction before coming under control and leaping forward. Katie held her fire. A dark figure streaked into her peripheral vision, running from the house toward the car. "Wait!" he hollered after the fleeing vehicle. The car whipped around the corner and accelerated out of view. Katie aimed at the man they'd left behind, who was without a mask. "Don't move, Ricky," she yelled, making an educated guess. "Police!" Ricky's gaze spun toward her position. The streetlight wasn't bright enough for her to make out his expression, but she could almost sense his panic. His hands were out to his sides, though, and she could see the clear outline of a gun in his left hand. "Drop the gun," she ordered. Ricky glanced down at his left hand, froze for a moment, then flung it away as if it had burned him. She heard it land in the crusty snow. Ricky's hand went into the air in the universal sign of surrender. "On your knees," Katie ordered, dipping her barrel slightly to accentuate the command. Ricky didn't move. Katie reached for her radio. 16, suspect vehicle has fled with at least 2 suspects, armed with a shotgun, last southbound on Haven, green 4-door Caprice or similar. I have 1 at gunpoint. As she spoke, Ricky's arms wavered and started to drop. By the time she finished her transmission, his hands hovered at shoulder level. "On your knees," she repeated. "Now!" Ricky ran. Katie let out a small curse, holstered her gun, and took off after him. She considered checking on the victims, but immediately rejected the idea. That would mean letting Ricky escape. And that wasn't going to happen. Katie crossed the yard, which was calf-deep in snow, until she got to the walkway. Then she was able to speed up. Luckily, Ricky stayed on the sidewalk. His thin form streaked down Joseph Street, the slap of his boots echoing back to her. She lengthened her stride, hoping she didn't hit a patch of ice, fall, and crack open her skull. Her baton slapped against her leg with each step. 16, I'm in foot pursuit, she managed to report as she sprinted. Eastbound on Joseph. Copy, 16. Suspect description? Katie didn't reply. How many people were running like a bat out of hell down the street at 4 a.m? Besides, she could already feel the bite of the cold air in her lungs and decided to save her energy. Ricky took her right on Haven, just like his getaway vehicle did. Maybe he was hoping that they were still around the corner, parked and waiting for him. He even slowed slightly, looking around, which allowed Katie to gain a few yards on him. She redoubled her efforts, pumping her arms and leaning forward as she ran. Ricky must have sensed her coming because he glanced over his shoulder and took off again. But his hesitation cost him, and Katie rapidly closed the distance between them. She steeled herself for a running tackle. Somehow, though, Ricky was able to match her speed, and after another second or two, it seemed like he was pulling away. He's too fast. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Katie heard the wailing siren that had been drawing closer, and suddenly, in a blink. Without thinking, Katie reached for her baton. The action caused her to slow slightly, but she didn't care. She drew the heavy baton, grasped it by the end, and cocked her arm. Then she flung it square at Ricky's retreating back and missed. The metal baton sailed past his right shoulder and clattered noisily to the sidewalk ahead of him. Katie would have cursed again, but her breath was already starting to become ragged in the freezing air. The surprise of the baton flying past him and hitting the sidewalk caused Ricky to duck a moment later. His delayed reaction threw him off balance. Katie felt a surge of satisfaction as Ricky's Ricky's foot caught something slick. He windmilled crazily and then crashed to the ground. She lowered her head and sprinted forward again. Ricky rose to a knee and pushed upward, but his foot slipped underneath him again. His knee slammed into the icy sidewalk, and he let out a howl of pain. Katie slammed into him, her momentum driving him prone. The pair of them slid several feet, Ricky on his belly and Katie riding him like a sled. Even as they came to a stop, Katie was scrambling upward to pin his head to the ground by placing her knee across the back of his neck. Ricky howled again as she drove his cheek into the cold cement. Katie ignored his cries. Hands out to the side, she panted, trying to catch her breath. Get off me, Ricky screamed. Hands, Katie ordered. Ricky complied half-heartedly, flopping his arms out to the side. That was good enough for her. She reached for the nearest gloved hand, grasped his first two fingers, and applied a wrist lock. Ouch! Shut up, she muttered. Katie brought his arm up and levered it against her knee, removed her handcuffs, and ratcheted the first cuff onto his wrist. She lowered his wrist to the small of his back. Give me your other hand, she directed him, applying some pressure to his back so he knew where she wanted him to go with his free hand. Christ, get off me, it hurts. It's cold and it hurts. Your hand, Katie repeated. Ricky brought his hand back. She took control of it, pushed the glove back, and slipped on the second cuff. Out of habit, she checked both cuffs to make sure they were effectively tight, but not biting into the suspect's wrists. Then she reached for a radio. Headlights, punctuated by flashing red and blue rotators, washed over her as she transmitted. Baker 116, one in custody. Code 4 here. And there ends the scene.
Go, Katie, go. I'm totally hooked on her. And it's obvious that you have a background as a police officer because I love how you wrote the scene. We all can feel it.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah. Great job, Frank. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing with us all of your great titles and your work. And listeners, if you happen to be up in Canada, go find them for that conference or at least go to the bar for the reading.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's been great, and I really appreciate the promotion.
Yeah, I am so glad we met via a newspaper. So we'll definitely.
You might be the first person I've met via a newspaper.
I know you might be my first. So, well, Frank, great luck on your podcast and keep doing it and all your writing. And it was a pleasure to have you.
You as well, and it was great to be here.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to the podcast. We hope you enjoyed the episode as much as we did. Follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter where you can be entered automatically each month to win a signed free copy of a book from an author that's appeared on the podcast. You can find out more at our website, www.squishpen.com. And finally, if you're an author in the Pacific Northwest and you would like to appear on the show, you can find out more on our website. So until next week, I hope you enjoy the journey. This is Vikki J. Carter signing off.